It started with a rumble under my boots and the sweet, sharp smell of earth. Just the kind of morning that makes you grateful for breath and space. I was standing on the banks of the creek that's curled along the edge of my family's property for over a century, watching the sunlight glint off water that's run through 3 generations of our hands. My granddad's land, before it was mine, and his dad's before that. We always treated the place like it was on loan, not just to us, but to anyone with a little sense about how to care for living things. I never expected that something as simple as shoring up a storm-ravaged creek bank would spark a war, but you know how it goes. One small ripple, and suddenly you're facing a tidal wave. I'd fired up my old Bulldozer just after sunrise, engine coughing to life the way it always did, reliable, if not pretty. There'd been a bad run of spring rains, left the bank looking like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out, roots hanging, mud slick, just waiting for a neighbor kid to take a tumble. I'd called the county, double-checked, no permit needed, then started laying riprap and stacking stones to keep the whole mess from sliding into the water. I'd barely made a dent when the white Tahoe rolled up. Neighborhood security patrol splashed across the door like we were living in some suburban police state. 2 men got out, black polos, gold crest over the heart, radios and stun guns on their hips. One wore aviators, the other gripped a clipboard like he could use it to bludgeon sense into anybody. They looked at me like I was about to dig a gold mine, not save a creek. "Sir, you need to cease operations immediately. This is common land. Heavy machinery's prohibited." The clipboard guy barked it out like he practiced in the mirror. I killed the dozer, boots squishing in the mud, and leveled my voice. "This is my land. I'm shoring up a bank before someone gets hurt." The guy with the aviators just smirked, but clipboard wasn't having it. "You're violating Ordinance 14B, unpermitted alterations to shared creek access." I almost laughed. "There's no shared access here," I told him, pointing to the trails end upstream. But they weren't listening. They were here to flex. "If you don't stop, we'll call a tow truck. Fines start at $500 a day." I shrugged. "Go ahead, but you better have your paperwork straight when the sheriff comes." They left after snapping photos, tires spinning out like they'd just taken down a cartel. By noon, the HOA office had hit me with 3 emails: cease and desist, notice of fines, mandatory hearing. They were fast, I'll give them that, official sounding, enough to spook someone who didn't know better. But I did. I spent years in the Army Corps of Engineers. I know property lines, deeds, water rights. Hell, I'd built levees in places where a mistake meant people drowned. What the HOA didn't realize: I held the original deed, creek, woods, watershed basin, the whole greenbelt behind their pretty houses. They'd built trails, benches, an observation deck back there without ever asking, but I'd let it slide. I didn't want drama. But blocking my bulldozer and threatening me with fines? That was a step too far. I walked the property line, camera in hand, GPS confirming every boundary. That evening, I spread the deed across my table, my granddad's signature, notary seal, the language spelling out stewardship of the land and water and all banks contiguous to the flow thereof. The county had reaffirmed it 15 years ago. I called the recorder's office for a fresh copy and gathered every permit, every email with the water board, ready to show anyone who needed proof. War was coming, and they had no clue who they'd picked a fight with. Next morning, I'm tightening bolts on the dozer when 3 vehicles show up, 2 sedans, 1 white Tahoe, HOA logos like sheriff badges. Out steps Karen Prescott, HOA president, in designer flats, big sunglasses, and a lavender scarf that probably cost more than my boots. She brought a camera crew and the same security officers from yesterday, plus a man with a tripod, as if they were staging a breaking news event. "Mr. Hayes," Karen said, voice syrupy sweet, "we're giving you a final opportunity to comply." I told her this wasn't a dictatorship, and their officers had no authority here. She dropped her voice to a public service announcement. "Your bulldozer is within 50 feet of a community waterway. That puts it under HOA jurisdiction." I told her, flat out, "That creek is on my deed." She tossed her hair. "Our revised community plan redefines boundaries." I laughed. "You think your newsletter overrides a legal title?" The camera moved in. She wanted to show the neighborhood the dangerous rebel. "You have 24 hours to remove all equipment. If you don't, we'll arrange removal and invoice you. Fines retroactive to yesterday." One guard swaggered up, handed me an envelope stamped with the HOA's crest, fine schedules, violation codes, a visual hazard assessment. All legalese. Get off my land, I told them. Karen turned to the camera. You're escalating things, Mr. Hayes. No, I said, you are. They left in a slow parade, waving to the camera like they'd filmed a victory. That's when the burn hit me. Not fear, but anger. This wasn't about the creek anymore. It was about legacy. I dug out every old document, plat maps, the 1948 title, the boundary regrant from 71. Still, I needed more. I called the county assessor's office and Sharon Riss, a real estate attorney I trusted. We met that afternoon, and I laid everything out. She flipped through the stack, silent and focused. Finally, she looked up. Daniel, you don't just own the creek. You own the entire watershed. They don't have a leg to stand on. We filed a declaratory statement, triggered an injunction barring HOA interference, and drafted a letter demanding removal of all HOA signage and benches. I left her office with new resolve. This was more than a fight. It was about memory, blood, and the woman who planted wildflowers here before cancer took her 5 years ago. The next morning, fog over the pasture, a mug of coffee cooling in my hand, I watched the creek glimmer in the dawn. Another email from the HOA, urgent environmental compliance required, full of threats and diagrams. They'd even stamped their logo on a map I'd drawn, claiming my land as HOA jurisdiction. That was no mistake, it was theft. I forwarded it to Sharon. Your move. Drove straight to the county clerk. Patrice, the records tech, brought out the full historical file, deeds, zoning memos, an old newspaper clipping of my granddad at a land use hearing. Buried in there, I found a 1992 contract with the state, custodianship of the watershed, ratified. Not just ownership, stewardship. Armed with documents, I attended the next HOA meeting. Karen stood at the podium in full power suit mode, talking environmental safety and shared resources. When she mentioned unregulated construction, every head turned. I stood, took the mic. The land you're talking about, the creek, the trails, that's mine. You've all been misled. The boards circulated false documents and sent security officers to threaten me on my land. Karen tried to cut me off, but I kept going. I filed an injunction. The county and the state are aware. Withdraw your claims, or I'll see you in court. Her smile vanished. I dropped the mic and left. That night, I sat by the creek, whiskey in hand, thinking of my granddad. He'd have told me, make them eat their own rules. And I planned to do exactly that. Then things got serious. HOA security returned with more guards, a lawyer in a gray sport coat, a camera crew, and barricades. Richard Bellamy, their counsel, handed me a glossy cease and desist folder. If you don't remove your equipment, the HOA will do it for you. I laughed, then handed him my certified land deed and a restraining order from the county court. Any attempt to remove that bulldozer is a direct violation of court order. He paled as he read, and so did Karen. When a guard reached for my dozer, I warned him off. The sheriff will be here in 10 minutes. And they were, along with the state DNR, who read out the boundaries, cited the HOA for violations, and started writing up fines for trespass. Karen and her crew left defeated, their power show over. A day later, the HOA caved. I got a letter from their new interim president admitting the eastern watershed, including the creek and trails, was in fact privately owned under protected trust. They canned the security firm, stopped all enforcement near my land, and started an internal review. They even sent a check for my legal fees and damages. Wasn't much, but it felt like an offering. Over the next week, benches disappeared, signs vanished, the last HOA camera was gone. In their place, I planted a new sign, Hayes Family Watershed, protected since 1948, preserved for all who respect it. That's what mattered. The story didn't stop there. News got out. A small local article, then Channel 5. Strangers wrote to thank me, to ask how I'd fought back, to share their own stories. Sharon, my lawyer, started a resource guide for anyone facing HOA overreach. Suddenly, my battle was a cause. The new HOA president, Ellen, was elected. She once got fined for planting native wildflowers. She stood at the podium and said, "We're here to rebuild trust." For the first time in years, I felt hope. I kept building an outdoor classroom for kids, field trips to the creek, a grant for water testing kits and trail lighting. Old neighbors came to help. Kids left drawings and messages in the guest book. Even Ellen came by with lemonade. What began as defense turned to stewardship. We restored native grasses, built accessible paths, and hosted monthly Watershed Wednesdays. The land wasn't just safe. It was alive. And then, closure. Karen Prescott resigned, exposed by a state audit for all the mess she'd left behind. Illegal security payments, forged memos, trespass. No grand exit, no speech, just gone. The neighborhood breathed easier. At Ellen's invitation, we gathered for an open-air lunch under the oaks, no one wearing labels anymore, just neighbors. Ellen hugged me. You gave us something we didn't think we could have, a voice. I didn't want applause, just a future where kids learned from the creek, not lawsuits. Sometimes, I'd walk the trail before dawn, boots in the dew, thinking of my father and granddad, of the lines they'd held and the roots they'd set. My son Jack called from overseas, asked if I'd ever thought of selling now that it was all over. I told him, it's not just land. It's a story. You only keep it alive by telling it. When he finally came home, he walked the trail with me, silent at first, then asked how the trust worked, what the grant meant. That night, he said, when the time comes, I'll protect it, too. The summer brought new life, kids, neighbors, even the town council naming our creek a heritage site, a conservation easement now protecting it forever. Sometimes I think back to the morning the dozer rumbled and the war began. The HOA thought I was alone. They didn't know I had history, law, and love on my side. When you fight for something real, not for profit but for what matters, it has a way of standing with you. The water still runs, the trees still rise, and I still walk this land, not as a victor, but as a keeper of a legacy. So what do you think? Was it worth it? Would you have stood your ground or walked away? Let me know down in the comments. Share your own HOA stories, or just tell me where you draw the line for what matters. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, enough, for a whole community to wake up and remember who they are.